Hello everyone. Today I'm going to be reviewing In an Antique Land by Amitav Ghosh. Now, uh, this book essentially is a travel log and a biography of Amitav Ghosh, and obviously it was a lot of research. It being written by one of the persons who does that kind of research in writing, Amitav Ghosh. The book is set up in Lataifa, Nashwe in Egypt, followed by Mangalore in India. Now, these places are essentially the footmarks, the travel route by one of the important characters of the book, who is an Egyptian merchant. Now, the themes which I could see in the story were travel basically of Amitav Ghosh to Egypt, and back in history, the travel of an Egyptian merchant called Ben to India, Mangalore, and the travel of one of his slaves from Mangalore called Bomma back to Egypt and back and forth. So travel here becomes a metaphor of the dissolving borders between these two vastly different countries. Then there is obviously themes about comparative history between India and Egypt, which is surprisingly very similar. Yet there is the comparative cultures which are vastly different and highly debated in the present day. There is also a theme about trade relations, which is something that kickstarts the story from the history, and how the trade relation between India and Egypt actually deteriorated with the advent of commercialization by Vasco da Gama, and then all of a sudden competition started to break apart these countries. The present day storyline also talks about stereotyping, because the people of Egypt aren't really able to understand the Indian cultures. The fact that Indians worship cows, or the Hindus don't have a prophet, or the Hindus don't get circumcised, or they burn the dead. All these seem to be highly criticized and stereotyped by the people whom Amitav meets. There is also a big role about superstition, because the people he meets around are highly superstitious. All of them seems to fear the evil eye, and various curses, and various exorcism rituals and stuff like that. The story is set in two timelines: the present timeline dealing with Amitav and his journey, and the timeline which deals with Beniju and his the past, that is set in 1100 AD, about his merchanthood. Now, Amitav's storyline, there's not much written about Amitav's childhood, except for the fact that due to the partition, he got held with his family in Dhaka as a refugee under a big compound, and his family started hosting the other refugees, and often he had to see the unseeable because of the majority Muslim population in Dhaka. And in his student days, he came across a letter in his library which referred to MSH6, which is basically the name of a slave, an Indian slave in an Egyptian place. So then he got really curious, because a slave's name is preserved and documented, which is a rare thing. This got him to Egypt. He went to Lataifa, started living with Abu Ali, and he made a huge detailed analysis of the Egyptian Lataifa culture, society, and people. There he found a storehouse, basically in Babylon, which is the synagogue of Benzera. He came across a lot of letters there, which were written in Arab, Hebrew hybrid language. With the help of his professors, he could translate that and decrypt the secret hidden beneath about Beniju and his storyline, which was later developed in the book. This got Amitav go to Nashwe, where he lived with more people, and then he came to India, basically traveling back the footpath of Beniju back in 1180. Uh, these are few of the characters that Amitav encounters in Nashwe and Lataifa. I've written a brief description about these people, just so that you could read them. Now we are going to Beniju's storyline. Now this storyline is set in 1100 AD. This is way before the advent of Vasco da Gama and his commercialization in trade. Basically, Beniju is a merchant, and we discover about Beniju because of the letters and communications he had with his friends Madmun and Abraham and Ishaq. All of these were written in Judeo-Arabic dialects with Hebrew script. Now, when Amitav decrypts these letters, he gets to know that Beniju actually visited Mangalore in India because of his trade in 1132 AD, and he started living with one of the slaves in Mangalore, who was Bomma. Now, the name Bomma itself, can be traced to Bhuta, which means a person dealing with the dead rituals and exorcism and stuff like that. So he's from one of those communities, a secluded community in Mangalore. This is surprising because an Egyptian rich merchant is living with a Mangalore slave, and he's documenting all the activities about the slave. The relationship itself is so weird that Bomma is entrusted with huge costly goods which are then transported back to Egypt and back and forth. So Bomma is entrusted with a lot of things, and yet he's trusted upon and is documented. Their language seems to be a problem, which perhaps, as Amitav Ghosh suspects, is a specialized trade language they use to communicate with. Now, the most surprising thing probably is the fact that Ben Ijo in India marries Ashu, who is a person from Mangalore, from the Nair community. Now, this is great because him being in Egypt has actually accepted India as a home, started living with one of his slaves, and got married in India. Now, all of these seem so utopic. The narrative itself, if I could analyze, I found traces of magical realism in the timeline, because the timeline wasn't, as I said, distinct. There was continuous jumping from the present to the past. And as the novel approaches to Mangalore, Amitav starts describing less about his experience in the present, and the story more or less becomes the history and the biography of Ben Ijo. There is also the intervening storylines of Amitav and Ben Ijo, the storylines of India and Egypt and their relationship, which is extremely intricately blended upon and made into a very beautiful book that is right in front of me. And the narrative deals with an interesting comparing and contrasting of instances. Every single character in the story is compared and contrasted with another character. Every culture, every belief, every opinion is compared and contrasted. And surprisingly, we see that most of the things that happened in the time of Ben Ijo was very similar, like-mindedness. But as we come to the present, things start becoming so debatable that people don't really start understanding each other. Now, understanding that, I started making interpretation of these narratives, and I ended up believing that the thing about stereotyping cultures is probably because of the fact that we don't really understand anybody fully, and hence we don't understand any culture as much as you try to. And that's probably the reason which leads to us stereotyping about that culture. So this whole thing could be a metaphor for the fact that even Amitav Ghosh wasn't able to truly understand Ben Ijo and his timeline, and that's probably the reason why the whole story becomes starts looking like a fantasy. There is also the comparing narratives that I spoke about. Everything is compared and contrasted. This could be a metaphor to the fact that back in the past, the borders between India and Egypt, though physically apart, was very merging, and the relationship was almost like one single tight bonded loving home. And now we see such a huge distinct culture, and such a huge barricading geography and politics between the countries, right? So this could be the reason why every single instance in the book is written as a form of comparing and contrasting between the other things around it. This brings me to the irony of the book, which just I came out of my mind. Probably the fact that a relation between Ben Ijo and Bomma and Egypt and India, which existed back in 1100 ADs, described here, is so utopic, that it's almost impossible for us to believe that such a thing existed. Looking at the present circumstance, which is experienced by Amitav Ghosh, which is quite drastic and quite painful, how he's facing the society in Egypt. Now, this brings us to a conclusion that probably, because of commercialization, competition, and all the advents that we had in recent times, the very integrity of these two countries are split apart, and now it seems also unreal, about the past. This was a review by me, Ritvik Surya, and thank you for listening.